Our guest for this session is John Lamphiere. He brings nearly 30 years' experience in sales, having worked for some of the largest global technology companies. Most recently, John was Vice President and Managing Director of International at Glassdoor, where he was responsible for the strategy and vision for Glassdoor's international business. He joined Glassdoor from Quantcast, where he was Managing Director of their international HQ in Dublin and Director of the global SMB business. Prior to Quantcast, John spent 6 years at Facebook as Regional Director for the UK and Ireland, as well as being the Global Director of Dating Partnerships and Sales. John, welcome to the Mindset Shift, and thank you for taking the time to join us here today.
You're welcome, Tim. It's great to be here.
So I'm very keen to find out about you, where you're from, your background, your upbringing, and those type of things. Obviously, you have a very successful business career, which we'll get to as we chat through this series. But tell me a little bit about John.
Yeah, it's kind of it's interesting. I had a pretty modest upbringing. Nothing special. I was actually born in Jersey in the Channel Islands. I moved back to Dublin when I was like three and a half. Went through a pretty normal schooling. I did have, however, I think at a pretty early age, have a realization that I enjoyed two things. Number one is I enjoyed people, and I kind of had an ability to interact with people in a pretty meaningful way. And that led me to a pretty early realization that that sales was a sort of a career that I would enter into. And actually where that came from was when I finished school, I did a gym instructor's course way back. This is like 30 years ago, before gyms were like the sort of the phenomenon, the trend that they are now. So I did a gym instructor's course, and I went to work in a gym part-time as I was in college. And it became pretty clear that, like, at the time, and probably still today, the hourly rate for a gym instructor was pretty poor. However, we used to get £10 for every new member that we signed up. So very quickly, I pivoted from the actual gym instruction part of the job to kind of hovering at reception, because I actually found that way easier. But I think, when I look back at that now, and I kind of, right the way through my career, that kind of very early working in a gym, selling memberships were one of the few things that there was no class denomination, right? People walked into a gym in the door in a tracksuit, had never been in a gym before. You had no idea, like, what socio-economic background they came from, what disposable income they had, what their interests and hobbies were. So as you kind of walked on that tour of that, like, 4.5 minute tour of the gym, you suddenly had to listen to them much more than go, you should join the gym because of this, right? So I think from that age, that was kind of where I wanted to be. I went and I did marketing in college in DIT in Anger Street. And came out of that sort of going, I don't really think I want to be, a brand manager for Colgate. Okay. But I had a much more of a kind of passion for that sort of sales side, and sort of started my very early career as a salesperson and stuff. So yeah, I think, that's kind of where it came from. But that's the one piece that I've always taken away from that like, to be able to be comfortable with that interaction with people and listen more so than speak.
So let's go back though to the Jersey aspect. So how did your family end up in Jersey?
My dad was a hotel manager. So kind of chef, they had to do all the remits of every aspect of a hotel. So he ended up qualifying as a hotel manager in Dublin, and then went to work in a hotel in St. Helier.
I actually stayed once in St. Helier in a European Championships in the Metropole Hotel in Jersey, and I was fascinated by Jersey. That was in the early 80s, and so maybe your dad was on the island at that point.
He could have been. It's an interesting. It's a fascinating place. I've been back a couple of times. I don't have any family there, but there's a lot of people my folks would have sort of grown up with that I've gone back and met subsequently. My godparents were there, so I've been back quite a few times to meet them. And I just find it's fascinating, the history of the island, the sort of the rationale and reasoning why it is tax-free today as a result of the Second World War. the hardships that they had to go through. Then this sort of like isolationist element of it. It's like a miniature play. I don't know. I just find it fascinating.
Had you siblings? And where did you come in the hierarchy?
I'm the eldest. I'm the eldest of two brothers. So both my brothers were born here.
And you talked about school. Was sport? Did you play sport, or was it just that you always like people? Because my experience is, in many cases, not all, but many people who like people end up in sports of some sort. Because the team environment is suitable to them. Yeah,
I did. I played soccer, football, GAA through school. I would say averagely well, but it was always pretty involved in it. Like I was always involved with sort of both teams. I think I would like to think that I was going to excel, but the reality was I was never going to be that sort of professional. But no, very involved. It was always more sort of team sports than individual sports I was interested in, and probably still am to this day.
And then you went to DIT. So did you go to, was that your first choice, or was it, something that you got secondly, or what was the focus?
No, it was kind of what I wanted to do. I mean, I think, all the way through school, I always felt that academia in its truest sense wasn't best suited towards me, or I wasn't best suited towards this. I did also always think that it was the means to an end, right? Like that, I had to do something. I picked marketing. I mean, there was a couple of different courses. It was like kind of marketing or a general business degree, but it was always going to be something that was pretty broad, because frankly, I had no real idea what I wanted to do. I mean, there was a lot of my friends that I would have gone up to school were very kind of focused on, I want to leave school, I want to do this in college, and this is what I wanted to do. I was kind of like, no, I don't know. I'd always kind of worked part-time. I frankly enjoyed the money, to be able to sort of have that freedom to be able to explore and expand was always really important to me. So I kind of went to college with I don't really know what I want out of this, but I know that it's broad enough that will sort of lead me to where I want to.
And if you were guiding somebody today who was looking to go to college, what advice would you give them now with the hindsight of your journey?
I mean, look, I think, and it's actually interesting. Like, I mean, even, within our circle of friends, the age I'm at now, a lot of our friends' children are now coming to an age where they're either thinking about starting college, or and quite a lot are actually finishing college. And it's always been my advice has always been the same, that at 16 or 17 or 18, it's very easy to say, this is where I want my life to take me. In my experience, with the exception of probably some professions, like somebody who goes and does medicine or becomes a doctor, it's pretty likely that they're going to spend their career in that world of medicine. However, in my experience, and even when that very, very few people follow a linear path, that the majority of people who become successful in a career have this kind of like jungle gym effect, that, they start here and then they kind of go over to this segment and then they come back this way and still end up there. But I've come across very few people who have that sort of linear, this is what I wanted to do when I was 17, and this is still what I wanted. This is where I want to finish my career. So, I mean, that's always been the advice. I think first and foremost, it's, my advice has always been, and if I look at my own career as well, is you've got to have a passion for what you want to do. Like, there's no point in being, even if you get all the points to do whatever, and you have to pick a courses, if you do something that is, that you don't have that like real passion and drive, then you can never excel at it, right? If you're going to be the best, you have to be truly in that bubble. And I mean, that's the advice. It's like, okay, do the best as you can, but start with something that you're fundamentally interested in. And then it will sort of evolve from there.
Because many people today facing the choice of college and facing those choices, tend to believe if they don't get their first choice, their world has finished. And, what you've just described is it hasn't finished. I know in my own experience, I would agree fully with that. being the best you can be every day is what we all should strive to be. Mm-hmm. And we can't do that if we don't have a passion for what we do. If we're doing something that we just do because it's a job, we won't give our best. It's just not possible in that sense.
Absolutely. And there's an example that I give. One of the best salespeople that I have ever worked with through my career. This person was absolutely phenomenal. And just, sales, people, everything else was just like, absolutely, I would put this person on a pedestal in terms of being really good. And her story was she finished school and, did really well in points and went to college, did a four-year degree in a subject that at the time had really high points, but she was one of the few that could get there. And, people who had else got really high points were going for this course. And it was town planning. And I remember saying to her, like, what were you thinking? Like you have evolved into being like a phenomenal people, salesperson, business leader. And she said, I don't know. It was like, this was a really high course. Very few people could get it. And I thought this is the way to go. And so I was in it 3 weeks and I went, what the hell am I doing in this? Like, I have no passion for town planning. Now she finished it and then she went off. But like, so I think there's so many examples of that where people have done something and then moved to here or vice versa.
So when you graduated from DIT, what was the start of your professional career?
At the time, technology always interested me. Not from a coding or or what we think about coding now or stuff like that, but just the general arena of technology interested me. So I had actually, again, and I think this becomes kind of like, you to an extent, you make your own luck or whatever it was. I'd worked in the gym all the way through college and I had been, relatively good at sales, or I had sort of made a few quid along the way through selling memberships. And actually one of the members that I had sold to had a IT company and basically supplied, they were a supplier, they were a distributor of IT equipment. And he said, hey, listen, why don't you come work for us? So I worked for them as a salesperson, was given a territory and up I went. And it was, go sell IT equipment to various contractors and builders and IT companies in various different organizations. And I remember doing it for the first 3 months were hard, right? You've never done it before, not in sort of a structured sales environment. But after 3 months, I went, yeah, this is what I enjoy. This is the people part of it. I never really felt I was selling people stuff. I felt it came natural trying to figure out a solution to whatever their problem happened to be. And, that solution obviously was what I had in my kit bag, but, so it went well. It was pretty successful. Taught me a lot. I was there for a couple of years, but, that's how I entered. It was very much a case of, I would say, opportunistic in some ways, but I think it was probably still true to this is what I wanted to do.
You mentioned it taught you a lot. What would be the key thing it taught you? Obviously, you like people, and you made a lot of tenors out of the gym sales in your college time. Mm-hmm. What was the real thing that journey took you and taught you at that point in time of your life?
I think it was probably a couple of things, and I've always tried to do a lot of self-evaluation when things go right and when things go wrong. Right, like our things go to plan or subsequently don't go according to plan, and that's try and analyze and try and figure out like why didn't it go according to plan. So, when I started in this role, this was a relatively small company. They were, had sort of evolved from being an electrical distributor into being an IT distributor. So a lot of the stuff was pretty new to them as well, and a lot of it, what the self-analyzation that I had to do was around why didn't that work? What was the process I needed to follow? Who else should be in this sort of sales cycle as opposed to, here's the IT manager of a company. Yeah, but who else needs to be involved in this conversation to ensure that this sale is going to happen or the tender process or whatever the case may be? And that started off with pretty small deals, and some of them were bigger and some of them were smaller. But it became about volume and saying, right, well, if I didn't get this one, why didn't I? Was that based on price? Was it based on offering versus competition? So, and the entire pipelining as well. So, because sales are typically on a monthly or a quarterly cycle, it was like, okay, yeah, well, you can sell something today, but then you've got to be thinking about this kind of 3-month plan, or how do you think about the future while balancing the here and now? So I think all of the elements of, what fundamentally is exactly the same sales process. Like, the sales process hasn't changed in 500 years, right? But each individual has to learn that and learn it as in, I was managing my own business, albeit you're working for somebody else. It's still, I've got targets to hit. It's like, how do you manage that? How do I ensure that the next 6 months are need to have X amount of conversations, to have X amount of quotes, to have X amount of deals. So yeah, that was a pretty steep learning curve, to be honest.
As somebody who obviously, was comfortable with sales and was comfortable with people, things like targets, which then became KPIs and OKRs, is just changing brand names all the time. Was that something that you took naturally to, or was that sort of a challenge for you?
No, it was always something that I had taken pretty natural to me. And again, I just kind of always implemented it into my overall job, which was running my own business, and that own business had a result and needed an output, but there was always things that needed to go into that to provide the output. So and even still to this day, I would still tell all my teams, you can't control the output. You can't control the amount of revenue you generate. You can only control the inputs that go into that. Like, how many phone calls do you make? How many meetings do you have? How many blah, 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 whatever the OKRs or the KPIs or whatever they are. But they're the only things you can control. You can't control the revenue. You do these things right and revenue comes. So I think I probably, in my own head at the time, it wasn't as formulated, but the process is kind of that sort of, I need to do this week to ensure that in 4 weeks' time I have Y.
And where did you go to from that role then? Where did you move on to next?
There, I moved from that organization to actually another similar organization, but I went in a little, obviously I've gone into this one as a sort of a very junior, never having done this before. And then I progressed into another company who did something similar. They were probably a little bit more of a technology edge, which I did something quite similar. And just sort of developed that sort of my own, my own abilities and strategies as a salesperson, but then moved into sort of managing people, which was a really small team. It was kind of like, okay, you're doing really well. We want you to be the sales manager for these 2 or 3 other folks. And that became another huge learning curve, right? Like, it's, you go to being, you control what you do, to suddenly success or failure is not about what I do. It's about actually what somebody else does. And I remember at the time, I think I started off and I had 2 people on the team. And that was okay because, I could pretty much manage going into the minutiae of each one of the other 2 deals. And, they would say, come to this meeting with me or come to that meeting with me. And that was fine. But suddenly then my team doubled and I ended up with 4. And it became, I can't be in every deal. I can't be in every meeting, because then I'm just working 20 hours a day and nobody else is really doing anything. So that became another huge learning curve, which is about sort of that. I knew I was able to help people, and I had that sort of people ability and be able to kind of read people pretty well and all that kind of stuff. But the trust element, I was never ready for the trust element, or because this is the way I would go about it, to automatically say, well, because I would go about it this way, or, I would pitch it this way, or I would answer this question this way, to automatically assume, well, that's the way everybody should do it. But then not everybody could pull that off the way I would do it, no more than I can pull off how somebody else would do it. So it took me quite a while to get to grips with saying to people, here's the fundamentals of what you want to do, but now you've got to wrap your personality around that. You've got to make that your own. And then the second part I found, which was a lot of learning, was when you were in a meeting with one of the other reps and potentially a client or whatever, and a conversation would go on a tangent, trying to stop myself from jumping in to go, okay, well, no, we should be over here, not over here, as opposed to, letting that go its way. And then when we both stepped out to then begin sort of coaching, well, how did you think that went? And what we could have done, well, here's my thoughts, what were your thoughts, and blah, blah, blah. So I don't think, it was never anything that was huge that I had to overcome. But these were all kind of questions I had to keep myself thinking about, like, how do I overcome this? What am I doing? What can I do better in terms of making this person better? So yeah, that was pretty the move into people management. And I still think to this day it's underestimated. The difficulty, and I still see it with my teams now, where you've got an individual contributor who then suddenly moves into people management. And it's like, yeah, I've got this, I've been selling this thing for years, or I've been doing this part of the operations job for years. I can take 3 or 4 people and teach them. And as much as I still say to people today, don't underestimate this, think about it. They go, no, I've got it. And then you have that sort of conversation a period of time later, and they go, okay, I didn't realize how difficult it is, or how differently you've got to approach it.
It's a fascinating point, and it's a point I really talk a lot to clients and to businesses about, because it's very difficult. You're this individual, you're getting the management job because you're the successful individual, and then you have to, in your case, you had 2 people, and they're not you. And I describe that as what I call a player manager, where you're expected to play and still manage. And that's a really difficult analogy. Mm-hmm. And I see it in sport. And I found it myself in my own sporting career, when I moved from playing after a couple of years into coaching, some of the players I was coaching were my teammates when I played. And I was judging them as I looked at them as a teammate, when I suddenly realized I've got to look at these as a coach. These is the hand I've been dealt. I've got to make them deliver their best, not my best or my view of their best. Mm-hmm. And it's really difficult. And the point you made, which is a great point, is that it's not easy, and people take it for granted, and organizations take it for granted. And we put people in and we say, you're the star in operations, you're the star in finance, you're the star in sales or marketing, whatever it is. Now run this team. And many people fail because we don't understand the transition from one to the other. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. No, 100%. I mean, it really is. And I'm not to jump off where I am now, but if I look at the sort of the latter part of my career, and a lot of technology companies have this, we've got to promote from within, and we've got to have this career ladder, and suddenly you've got at 30% of your management team are under a year in terms of management tenure. It becomes a really dangerous place unless there's an infrastructure unless there's a period of time and an infrastructure to help this 30% of managers become really strong, because it's really difficult to have the buy-in of your peers, because you were suddenly a peer and then you become a manager, and then these people, your ex-team or your ex-colleagues, are looking and going, well, what do you bring to the table from a management perspective? I look at an external hire over here who comes in with a bunch of experience and blah, 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 blah. And this is the value they bring to the team. So it's a really difficult balance.
And it's interesting because, you made a reference to the fact that you're in a meeting, a sales meeting, and the salesperson that you're not responsible for isn't doing what you would do, and maybe could cost you the sale. And the tendency is to jump in, especially if the sale is really big, I mean, philosophically, we're all supposed to sit back and say, well, we won't jump in. But what tends to happen is we do jump in, and then we coach them afterwards and tell them why we were great and they were, have to learn how to be great. Yeah. And that's in any environment, whether it is technology, whether it is finance, as I said, or operational, that desire to get the pressure points it's succeeding is the really critical moment to understand. I've got to let them get it successful, because I won't be at every meeting in that sense. But it's really something, John, that I have a very passionate viewpoint about, that transition from the playing role in your job or in your team to the management role is something we underestimate and still do consistently. Tell me then, so you went into management, you had 2 and then you had 4, and obviously you progressed in management then. So
yeah, for sure.
What was the next part of the journey?
I suppose the next pivotal part was I joined a company called Conduit, who, for anybody listening who's old enough to remember, owned the 118 directory inquiries back when there was a directory inquiries, and if you wanted a number, you had to physically ring somebody to get it, right? So I went in to lead a team. So directory inquiries had deregulated from the old post and telegraph thing, and Conduit were primarily a outsourced call center, but they also owned a 118 direct inquiries number, and within that they had what they called Business Finder, which was one of the revenue streams from that. So I started with Conduit to manage and to lead their Business Finder team, which was a team of about 30 people, a couple of team leads. And essentially, we sold business listings. And I say this is pivotal because, again, this was how I ended up on the internet. Like when I was, back in doing marketing or back in school, I mean, the internet didn't exist, right? So it wasn't like I want to go off and have a career in the internet somewhere. So I was so we were in Conduit. We were doing really well. Revenue was very, very good. Team was growing. Everything was good. And the CEO at the time, a guy called Liam Young, came back from somewhere, and he had bought the URL 118.com. And I'll never forget it. It was kind of like I got called into the office, and the conversation went something around, we have this URL 118.com. We're going to build an online directory inquiries business. He was like, okay. And there was here's the technology folks that are going to actually build it, and you need to do all of the commercial side of it. So, and that was a Friday evening. I think there was quite a large bottle of wine consumed that Friday night. Got my head around it over Saturday and Sunday, and came into work on Monday. But I mean, that's what sort of brought me into two things, unbeknownst to myself at the time. First and foremost, the internet. Like, we became 118.com. We built a direct inquiries business across 5 different countries in Europe. Launched it with a whole bunch of salespeople, operational people. So it kind of brought me into that kind of online world. The second part that did was it brought me into not just the revenue generation piece, but what needs to be there to facilitate revenue generation. So being commercial, it was not necessarily just about making a sale. It was about how do we take a transaction? How does that payment get processed? How do we list a listing? What are operations, customer support, like all of the gamuts of a total commercial business. So yeah, again, and I think, in each step of my career, I've always been wanted to kind of test myself, wanted to continue to learn and grow and stuff. So that was another pretty big pivotal milestone. We spent a couple of years there and, grew that business. Subsequently, Conduit was acquired by a US organization called, the name escapes me right now, but they were very much more focused on the outsourced call center business as opposed to the direct inquiry business. So I moved from there to Yahoo. So I had now sort of had this experience in the internet, I would say, getting more experience in terms of running teams and much larger teams. I think Conduit was a team of about 60 across the traditional business and the online business. So I went into Yahoo as we were building a mid-market sales team for Europe. So it was, team didn't exist in Dublin. It was build, launch a team, everything else. So that was kind of, I would say Conduit was a stepping stone into the internet. Yahoo was the first proper technology online company. And at the time, I spent we did really well in revenue. We won a whole bunch of awards. It was one of the highest performing teams in Europe, actually across Yahoo at the time. The part, I think, for me with Yahoo was at the time Yahoo was coming towards the end of being a market leader. It was the innovation, even in the 2 years I was there, the innovation started. It was nearly like what you don't want your organization to be. And I remember having, with peers and we'd have conversations, but it was very much like everybody was afraid to put their head above the parapet. Because if there was no innovation, there was no, here's how we can do this better. Like, even Conduit was, we can do this, let's try this. Some things will work, the things that don't work, really recognize them quickly, reverse out of it and go a different direction. Yahoo is just very stagnant. And while revenue was okay, they still had a pretty phenomenal brand name across the globe. It wasn't somewhere that personally I got excited about what was coming next with Yahoo. It was kind of like, this is what it is. And if anything, it was kind of contracting and it was trying to fight to hold what you had versus trying to go differently. So around about the same time, Facebook was launching in Dublin. This is probably 2009, late 2008, 2009. And Facebook was, when you think about Facebook today and you think about Facebook in 2009, they're two completely different things, right? At the time, I think Facebook had about 300 million active users. Today it's 2 billion or something like that. So it was pretty marginal. There was very little in Europe. They had recently, actually Facebook were in a shared office space when I started talking to them. There was like 15 people in an office. So I started very early on. And my role was to build a mid-market sales team. We hired kind of the first person for France, first person for Germany. And that thought, like my 5.5 years in Facebook taught me so much about corporate, how to scale a business, how to be really profitable, how to constantly evolve and constantly change. And I'll tell you one of the, I'll give you an example of one of the things that I mean by that. I remember the VP of our area used to come to Dublin probably once a quarter. And I was, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 quarters in at this point in time. And everything was going great, right? Like we used to do, quarterly business review for him. And I remember, like 50 slides and everything was up and to the right. Like, user numbers were up and to the right massively, revenue, head counts, blah, blah, like everything. There was like on every slide, it was up and to the right. And I remember like he had been there every quarter and I remember sitting there going, yeah, well, this is going to be pretty straightforward. Like everything is better than it was last quarter. So I went through the business review and, normal, I would say, questions through it. And got to the end of it and he looked at me and he goes, yeah, it's pretty disappointing though. And I honestly, I nearly fell out of the seat. I was like, disappointing. This is like, 140%, 120%. And he said, no, what I mean is, he said, you're doing great. Like the business is doing great. It's growing at a phenomenal rate. But he said, I've never had an email from you saying, we tried this and it didn't work. So you're going to see a drop here. And because that's as a result of what we tried and didn't work. He said, you can't be trying everything and you can't be pushing as hard as you can without having some things that don't work. So when I look at kind of what you're doing within your business, it's like you're not taking enough risks. You're not, the status quo is great. Like, 106% is fantastic, but could that be 170%? And I remember coming out of that going, wow, all right, this is kind of a license to really try and accelerate and try and figure out things differently. So you had that coupled with my role kind of evolved into not really selling, but becoming a facilitator of sales. So, and I give examples like, along the way, which was, we launched a product in Germany and the product itself is fantastic and advertisers wanted to use it, but, huge resistance around privacy. And it's like, okay, well, how do we get over this hurdle that we had to sort of, we had to build this kind of team of outsourced lawyers because only the lawyers within a German organization would trust a lawyer. They're not going to listen to any given salesperson me or anyone else. Became much more integrated with operations and how do you scale those teams? How do you scale across multiple different languages to be able to continually do more with the same? How to integrate technology, how to work with product teams, how to get much more involved. Like I ended up running the global dating vertical, which was a really interesting one because at the time, the sentiment from Facebook users towards dating was terrible. It was worse than gambling. It was like show somebody a gambling ad before you show them a dating ad, right? Because all of this connotation. And then you had a lot of stuff that just wasn't going up. It wasn't good because advertisers could use self-serve. So like ads were going to places that nobody wanted to go to and all that kind of stuff. So actually Mark and Cheryl were on the verge of shutting down the dating vertical. And I ran Europe and specifically the UK as well, which had a lot of bona fide dating advertisers in there, like the genuine sort of dating companies. So that made up a pretty big chunk of my revenue at the time. So I remember like I put together a proposal and said, like, give me 6 months, let's try and fix this. So I had, I seconded in a bunch of like data analysts, data scientists, and we really started looking at where people were coming from. So we made like a lot of policy changes. We took like dating out of the self-serve platform. And subsequently sentiment towards dating ads became higher than the average of all ads. Okay. So my role evolved from just like, I still own the number and that was always first and foremost what I was judged on, but it suddenly became, well, if we're going to do more, we need more users in a market, or we need more engagement with those users, or we need more technology to think about stuff. So I spent, over 5 years, really, really good there. Like when I talk about self-learning and sort of pushing myself, that was incredible. It just taught me how to think about business and operations completely differently.
There's no doubts, John, though, that the conversation with your VP about expanding your risk taking. Okay, now you're a sales guy. I mean, so you've come through the sales, you've become a sales manager. You're taking on, in Facebook a larger role, but fundamentally you still have this sales passion and this energy to drive revenue because you're judged on revenue in the role you're in. And yet that pivot, that switch that he made you look at a different lens of your role, even though, as you say, everything's up to the right, so the world is wonderful. And he's saying, no, it's not just about everything being up to the right. And for those people watching this series or listening to the series, it's the right of the graph is the positive side of it. It's the bottom is the negative side of it. And he's saying to you, that's something you must really become more focused on. You must drive more. When you move from Facebook into your next role then, was that extra pivot that you'd become aware of a real factor for you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's like anything in my career, and I think this is about adopting or self-learning, but also being really open and adopting feedback, right? To go like, it's a good thing, keep giving me feedback. Don't like ever not say anything. But sort of like to a point where I feel I built it in and it just became part of the norm. That, from that day on, I remember saying, right, well, now I look at what every team does differently, what every kind of individual does, and how do we bring all this together that, that the sum of all parts equals even more? How do I make trade-offs across, like, is my natural reaction before that would be just, let's hire more salespeople. Or are you giving me 5 heads to hire this quarter? They should be salespeople. That's the best way to get to more revenue. But actually what that did was say, well, hang on, if I can hire, instead of 2 salespeople, if I hire 2 measurement people, does that give the salespeople more ammunition? And each salesperson does 10x what they would have done without them. So to really start thinking about stuff very differently. So all subsequent roles, or the 2 subsequent roles after Facebook, I have been very cognizant of continually doing that. And actually that was one of the, it's interesting actually, it's one of the reasons that I actually left Facebook. Okay. Was from that sort of an element, not that directly, but that sort of, as I spend long period of time in Facebook started to grow into this big behemoth. And it grew into what was like a phenomenally big, successful corporate organization. Towards the latter end, I started questioning, going, well, what is my role here? And it was kind of interesting. I remember coming back to my kids and my wife and telling them I was thinking about leaving. And, my kids nearly needed therapy afterwards because they were the most popular kids in the playground because, Facebook.
How many children do you have, John?
I have two.
Okay.
I have two. They're 14 and 17 now. So they would have been, like early teenagers.
Yes.
So after they picked, well, the way I kind of described it to them is you can be this captain of a ship. Like you can be captain of a super tanker and you can have like, close on $1 billion quotas and everything else, huge numbers. But really you come in and you kind of walk around the deck. The course is predefined at that point, and you go from point A to point B. What the realization that I came to myself was I much prefer being that sort of captain that stands on the beach and goes, right, where do we want to try and get to? And, what do we need to build to get us there? And then 100 course corrections later, you may or may not end up in that place, right? And that's what I wanted. That's where I'm kind of most fulfilled, is when I'm truly building. So I made a decision to leave Facebook and I moved to Quantcast. Quantcast were a programmatic advertiser. I went in as their managing director. They're a programmatic advertiser, and I spent 3.5 really good years there, built a lot. We launched a whole bunch of markets, grew a team pretty substantially, brought revenue, generated way more revenue as a percentage of the overall. And I probably jumped to maybe Glassdoor, whereas that's my kind of last role. And I was in Quantcast. I had met the CEO of Glassdoor quite a few times, and I really liked what they were doing. I liked what Glassdoor were trying to do in terms of help people find a job in a company they love, bring that sort of transparency to the world of employment. And the part, so I went in as the VP of International or Managing Director of across our international business. And
just on really that point, John, just on that point. So you're the MD of Glassdoor at the start of 2020. Okay. You made a point there, you just briefly, that you probably jumped too quickly from Quantcast. Okay. So, that's something in your mind, but that might be hindsight too. That could be hindsight looking back because of circumstances as they've evolved. But at the start of 2020, Glassdoor obviously was looking very positive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was an incredible year for a whole bunch of different reasons, right? Including COVID. So I'll take you right the way back up to the beginning of 2020. I had been in Glassdoor for 2 years. We had scaled our international business really substantially. We had quadrupled the size of the team. We had launched 9 new markets for Glassdoor. We had launched sales offices in a bunch of companies. We'd acquired and integrated Love Mondays in Latin America into the team. We had I had a dedicated product team, and then everything else that went with it. Revenue was going really well. Consumer growth was going well. In February, I had presented to the board of directors a 5-year plan, which would see, again, a sort of a quadrupling of revenue, headcount, new markets, territories, marketing allocated, like everything. Board were all pretty happy with it. And then we got to the 1st of March, right? And Glassdoor, mid-sized recruitment platform in a world that, was being described as similar to the outset of the Second World War, right? You're like, wow, okay, yes, this is bad, but is it this bad? And recruitment just fell off a cliff, right? Now, Glassdoor had been acquired by Recruit Holdings. I hadn't got tremendous cash reserves, so it became really tricky. So the middle of June, the board made a decision to merge together the go-to-market functions of both Indeed and Glassdoor, which meant that the majority of people outside of the US that I had hired, that were all part of this kind of international team, were facing redundancy. Personally, I was facing redundancy, and then the majority of the sales teams in the US the same. So probably a third of the workforce were made redundant in June.
So COVID obviously had a big part to play in that, because obviously the impact of the pandemic. How have you responded since then? I mean, obviously you're now out of the role in Glassdoor, and you're doing some consultancy and supporting companies in different ways at the moment. But how have you personally responded? To, I mean, if you look at your career, it's phenomenally successful. We talk about the upper right hand side of the chart, and you had nothing to do with what happened in Glassdoor. That's a pandemic issue from that point of view. But it still is, an impact on you, obviously, and your family. How have you responded, and how have you addressed the challenge that presented you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and it's, I think, through the period that we'd worked through the various different consultation processes in most jurisdictions across Europe as we went through, the whole redundancy process, and because I was MD of the region, it was kind of like it was me, albeit I was impacted in exactly the same way. But I don't really have a thought about it, because through that sort of probably 8-week period that I knew, and 4 weeks, and then all of the talk announcements and stuff like that, and then the consultation process, it was very much about the team. How do I manage a team through this, which is a really difficult period for everybody, but for some people more than others. You've got a pretty diverse workforce in terms of some have, single, and you're pretty confident that they can weather a storm and go out and get another job. And then people that have very young families and mortgages and all that kind of stuff. So it became really difficult. So personally, I didn't really have a thought for me personally through the time. Then I think the overwhelming feeling that I had initially as we came to an end, and suddenly it was like everybody was, I had done everything that I could by the rest of the teams. Then it became very much about, it's the first time in my entire career that I felt I had to walk away from, but the journey wasn't finished. It was like I wasn't done with the mission. I knew that the potential, we had this business plan signed off, and it was like, I know it's not finished, but yet I'm not a part of it. That we're not on this journey anymore. And that actually became really difficult to fathom, and to sort of to become acceptant, to accept that, and just to go, okay, it's done. It was out of my control completely, blah, blah, blah. I think personally, one of the things that I have learned over my years across different organizations and stuff is, everybody has a story that has defined them. No matter who it is, and I've done this with most leadership teams, with most of the teams that I've hired and stuff, is, you go out and you go, tell me a situation that has defined you as an individual, not as a business person, but just as an individual. And everybody has a story, right? Everybody has a loved one that has had difficulties, or they've had difficulties in a personal life, or they've had, their own battles, traumas, or good things, not so good things. And that it's those things that define you as an individual, right? I don't feel this it's just part of that journey. It's part of what defined me. And I've had, things in my personal life that have defined me. And so I think, I relatively quickly got over this sort of this journey wasn't finished. And so I personally feel that this has just been another thing that defines you. It is a learning. I learned a hell of a lot through that 3-month period about managing teams and individuals, and the HR and legal processes and everything from multiple jurisdictions across the globe. But I think that what I have gained out of it is I became very focused on taking time out. Not since school holidays have I ever had more than 2-3 weeks off in the summertime. So, it's happened in June, and I categorically said, I'm not even going to speak to anyone until at least the autumn time. About what comes next. Not consultancy, not another role. I'm just going to chill out. I did a course in garden architecture, which is completely different to what I've ever done. So I actually feel I've taken a lot out of it. I think it's been really good for me personally. And I think I go back into now thinking about what comes next with a sort of a much more objective viewpoint than, okay, I'm this has happened. Now I need to get a job here. And, my advice even to a lot of the leadership team and the management team in Glassdoor was like, make sure you take time for yourself here. You've got to let this go, but you've got to be sure that this is let go, that you're not just jumping into something for the sake of jumping into it.
Well, for me, John, it's been fascinating to chat to you. I mean, there's been a few pivots that I've picked out through your career. Obviously, the 10 quid for the gym, I think, is brilliant. I think the conduit pivot you talked about, the VP in Facebook is one you talked about, and the pivot that you've taken through the pandemic as a result of the Glassdoor experience on your journey is to take time out. It's been an absolute pleasure, John, to chat to you. You've been a superb guest to have. The best of luck with the next part of your journey, which I have no doubt will be as successful as the previous part of your journey. And I look forward to keeping in touch and hearing from you.
Tim, thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for watching The Mindset Shift. Don't forget to subscribe to get a new episode delivered straight to your inbox. You can do this by following the details below.